Let's break down my favorite weapon in the game, the Holger 26. If you know me from my airsoft stuff, or you watched any of my other videos, you probably know that the G36 is my favorite weapon of all time. And I'm talking about the full-size one, not the C or the K. So whenever I see a G36 in the game, you know that I will probably be using it, especially when I'm just having fun. In Warzone, the Holger 26 is supposed to be a more mobile and more accurate LMG, similar to what the M13 is to the assault rifle category. Does the Holger succeed in this though? Kind of. It's pretty mobile, but it's not that long range. Although its stats are extremely comparable to the Grau, which is what we'll be using to compare to when we get to the stats. But before we get into the stats, let's take a look at the builds I would recommend and the build we'll be breaking down the stats of. I won't be breaking down every single build I got, but here's one more general build, here's one for anti-vehicles, here's one for slightly longer range, and here's one for long range. Quick note, the VLK and the 4x integral are stat-wise pretty much identical other than their zoom. Let's break down that last build, the long range Holger 26. In this build, we have the monolithic suppressor, the tac laser, the Solo Zero 4x integral, the commando foregrip, and stipple grip tape. Also, if you're interested in the other stats of the other builds I have here, you can easily see them, and the one I'll be talking about is highlighted in blue. So let's get into its stats, starting with mobility. So its ADS time is 300 milliseconds, which is really comparable to most other long-range ARs, and it even beats out some of them. But it is much faster than basically every other long-range LMG. Your reload and reload add times aren't really the greatest. They're pretty slow, but remember that your magazine cap is 100, so that's pretty good. And even with this, that's like half the time of something like the PKM. Its movement speed is really great. It's way faster than basically all long-range assault rifles, and it's even faster than any LMG. Its sprint speed though doesn't look like the greatest, but when compared to other assault rifles and LMGs, it just blows them out of the water. So you could technically be running around with this, and if you have a Psychov, you're actually better running around with this than that. So if you see some danger, you can easily just ADS and start firing instead of having to swap and then fire. Its ADS strafe though is really bad. It's 1.32 meters per second, and even other long-range assault rifles and LMGs will be beating this. Its sprint out time and tactical sprint out time aren't the greatest, but when compared to other long-range assault rifles or LMGs, it's really good. Its stability at 1.5T is pretty typical for most long-range assault rifles and long-range LMGs. Its bullet velocity though is a disappointing 862.7 meters per second. And remember, this is the maximum it can get. And its rate of fire is 11.76 rounds per second or 706 rounds per minute, which isn't really that great, but for a longer range weapon, it's not the worst thing in the world. When we add up all the numbers, we get a final mobility score of 33, which is pretty good for a long-range LMG, or pretty normal for a long-range assault rifle. Its recoil is an interesting situation because you have a lot of visual recoil, but when you actually look at the pattern, it's one of the best in the game, only being beat out by things like the M13 and the Fin. Just note that it'll sometimes randomly switch the recoil pattern from the nice curve to a weird S shape, which is easy to control, but just a little bit unexpected. So if you center your target in the middle of the screen, regardless of whether the reticle is and all the screen shaking going on, you will be hitting every single shot. Because of this, it gets a recoil score of 48. Its damage isn't the greatest. Its TTK isn't competitive up close or at range, and you'll be finding yourself being outgunned by many weapons. Compared to long-range assault rifles though, its time to kill up close is a little slower, but at range, it's actually a little faster. At long range though, if you mix in at least one headshot with the rest of your shots, you'll reduce the number of shots you need to down someone by 1. And up close, you'll need 2 headshots in order to reduce your number of shots needed to down someone by 1 as well. Assuming you can get these reductions, your time to kill will actually be pretty competitive. So when we add up its damage points, we get a score of 35, which is exactly the same as the Grau. And when we add up all the scores, we get a final score of 116, which is a little bit on the lower side for long-range weapons, but it is still 2 points higher than the Grau. And while there's technically nothing wrong with this weapon, and it would be pretty balanced, there's just one stat that changes everything. It's velocity. Having pinpoint accuracy doesn't mean much when you fire your bullet and there's a delay of 200 milliseconds between the time you fire and the time it hits. And not just lead your shots, but actually having to put your reticle a lot higher than where your target actually is. So despite this, why do I still use this weapon, and how can you use this effectively? I just run around the map with this, already out, and I aim down sights faster than the enemy can react, and I start shooting. They'll probably start shooting me between my 4th shot, but by that time, it will be too late for them. If someone sees me and starts firing on me though, my best bet is to take cover and then find a good spot where I can control my recoil and shoot them, but their recoil may be a little bit too much. But as soon as I start approaching a building or a more close quarters area, I will switch to my Psychop. Or if I have a overkill loadout already, I will probably be running around with that because I'll probably be using an MP7 and that is good for 0 to 40 meters. If you're using the 1x optic though, your ADS time and your movement and strafe speed are good enough, so you wouldn't really have to switch to a Psychop, and you may actually want to run a launcher as a secondary. But if you hit all your shots, and even if you, especially if you hit 2 headshots, you'll actually be pretty good. And at longer ranges, up to 100 meters, you'll be beating the Grau and the M13. But as soon as you pass that threshold, you'll be at a great disadvantage because you'll have to start leading your shots and raising your reticle. When a target is mounted or they're just sniping somewhere, then yeah, this is pretty usable. But as soon as your target starts moving, you'll start to see the flaw. But you can see that it's not a bad gun, but it's just outclassed by everything. And it hurts me seeing my favorite gun like this because it has so much potential, just it needs a tiny little bit of tweaking. So if anyone from Raven Software sees this, please consider changing a few of these things that I'm mentioning. In my opinion, the Holger should have been classified as an assault rifle, not an LMG. Sure, it's had a few tweaks making it closer to an assault rifle over time rather than LMG, but it still retains a few of the things like slower ADS strafe and its innate slower ADS time. So the easiest one-step fix recommendation I have to make the Holger viable is just to raise its bullet velocity when combined with the monolithic suppressor to 1,000 meters per second, or if you're feeling a little generous, 1,100 meters per second. Right now, the SA-87 has a better TTK basically everywhere compared to the Holger, and has a much higher innate bullet velocity, which gets even better when you use the monolithic suppressor. So the Holger should be treated the same here. This would bring it a lot closer to its intended role of being a long-range assault rifle LMG hybrid. And because of its innate 100 round mag, I would say it's okay to keep its ADS time that low and its ADS strafe speed that low. If I could request a few more changes though, I would first decrease its visual recoil. I would then also only have one recoil pattern. Keep the curve, it's easy to learn, and I would just throw out the S shape because it's easy to control, but it just sometimes feels weird that you have to correct in a S-shaped pattern when you normally don't have to. Now, if also possible, I would request that the rate of fire be increased to 730 rounds per minute to match the Grau's. You may now be thinking though that the Holger would be a better Grau now, but actually that's not the case. Even with that TTK, it would actually be identical up close, and at range, yes, the Holger should be a little bit better, but it's an LMG. It should be, but it still would have less bullet velocity. So at 1,000 or 1,100 meters per second, it would still be 200 or 300 meters per second less than the Grau. So the Grau would still have a better advantage at longer ranges. Remember, with the Meta Grau, you don't actually have to run any attachments to reduce your ADS time because it has great ADS time to begin with. But with the Holger, you have to run the tack laser and the stapled grip to get it low. So how would these changes reflect on my chart? Starting with damage, it actually wouldn't be moving up. It would stay exactly the same, it's just that the scores would be higher within that category. Its recoil score would only change by 1 point, and that's only because the changes would be mostly visual, and it would just make sure that it only has one pattern that it would use. And its mobility points would now be 35 instead of 33, which would be 1 point more than the Grau, but this would bring its final score to 119, which isn't the highest score, but it's a lot closer to more versatile guns in the game. And in the end, this would just make it a better long-range weapon. It won't destroy anything up close, and it certainly won't be destroying anything at range, but it'll just fit its role a lot better. And even if the only thing they ever change is just the bullet velocity, it would only bring it up by 1 point in mobility and 1 point in its total. So I would be perfectly happy with that because it would just make my use of it a lot better. The harder way to buff this though would be to add a new barrel. It doesn't even have to be different, it could be visually the same as the one we have now, just with a different name, but when combined with a monolithic suppressor, it should increase its bullet velocity to 1,200 meters per second. This would mean that we would have to lose one attachment, and it probably should be the Commando foregrip. So, unlike many of the other long barrels, I actually suggest that this barrel should, instead of reducing vertical recoil, it should act like a Commando foregrip, increasing its aiming stability and recoil stabilization. And in order to balance this barrel, it should definitely be reducing your movement, sprint, and strafe speeds, similar to what the Commando foregrip would be doing now anyways. It would be a special attachment similar to how the PKM has the snatch grip. Its TTK wouldn't still be the greatest, but with the increased bullet velocity, it would at least be a little bit closer to being competitive with the Grau at longer ranges, although it would not be at close range. If possible, they could also increase the rate of fire with this barrel to the Graus, but that would be asking a little bit too much. At that point, they would need to balance it out a little bit more by adding some ADS time of 8 or 16 milliseconds to make sure that it's not too OP. But that's the Holger 26. What do you think about it? And have you ever run it? And if you did, how did you set it up? Would you ever consider using it after this video? Or will it just be one of those guns that you just won't ever use? And what do you think about my proposed buffs to this weapon? Do you think that would make it viable? And do you think that they're fair? Let me know in the comments. And if you know anyone who works at Raven Software, please show them this video so that I can maybe get my favorite gun being a little bit more viable. And if you want me to rate your favorite gun or your favorite build, post it here or on Instagram and you may see it next Community Wednesday. Or if you got any questions, topics, or ideas, not just about Warzone, but either about Airsoft or other games, post them because I'm not just the Warzone channel. But that's the video. If you have enjoyed it or it's helped you in any way, let me know by leaving a like. If you got any questions or comments, leave them down in the comment section down below. And if you want to make sure that you never miss another video, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching.